It was the kind of story that Kansas towns tried to bury, but never could. The night a preacher, cloaked in authority and scripture, crossed the one line no law, no church, and no community could forgive. A midnight ceremony, a forbidden vow, a scandal that would ripple through generations. Before we step into that shadowed moment in 1899, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story is traveling tonight. In Kansas in 1899, the statutes that governed marriage left no room for ambiguity. The language declared that any union between a parent and a child was incestuous and void. This was not a matter of interpretation or loophole, but a blunt statement of law. The criminal code matched the civil law with equal severity, listing incest as a punishable offense under crimes against morality and the family. A preacher, or any man, who entered such a union would stand outside both church doctrine and state law. The county courthouses served as the first repositories of evidence. Marriage registers noted names, dates, and officiants. Clerks entered details in careful handwriting, columns aligned in ledgers that still survive in many places. Criminal dockets carried indictments, charges, pleas, and sentences. These paper trails, often mundane, became the authoritative markers of what had actually taken place. Newspapers transformed those dry records into stories that gripped their readers. Local editors in small Kansas towns printed accounts of arrests or whispered midnight ceremonies. Sometimes the words were brief, a paragraph inserted between notices of farm sales and railway schedules. At other times they stretched across columns, painting the scene in tones of outrage, moral warning, or prurient detail. From there, larger regional papers picked up the stories, and they spread far beyond the county line. The church added another dimension. In 1899, a preacher was more than a man who delivered sermons. He was often central to the life of a rural community. If accusations arose against such a figure, congregations faced turmoil. Elders might call meetings, neighbors might break fellowship, and the pulpit could be silenced. The intersection of spiritual authority with public scandal carried weight that no simple crime report could capture. These strands, the law, the records, the press, and the church, formed the environment in which any reported midnight ceremony would have been received. Each left its own type of evidence: the statute book's declarations, the courthouse ledger's ink, the newspaper's headlines, the congregation's whispers. Together they framed the world of Kansas at the end of the century, a world that would not ignore an act so starkly at odds with both law and custom. The year 1899 in Kansas was marked by contrasts between the quiet rhythms of rural life and the occasional eruption of scandal that could unsettle entire communities. Most towns lived at a pace set by the harvest, the rail depot, and the calendar of church services. Within that order, a preacher held a prominent place. He was entrusted with guiding the congregation, officiating marriages, baptizing children, and presiding over funerals. His authority was rooted in trust. When whispers arose that a man of the cloth had defied both state law and divine ordinance, the story could not remain private. The legal structure already stood ready to confront such an act. Kansas marriage statutes did not allow for interpretation that might excuse a union between a father and daughter. The statute book declared such marriages void, erasing them in principle even if they were spoken into being by ceremony. Yet the presence of a ceremony itself, especially one held at night and away from the public eye, carried significance. A record in a marriage ledger, if entered by a clerk, could grant the appearance of legality. A witness, if called, could testify that vows were spoken. Thus, the machinery of the law depended on evidence. Who was present, what was written, what was reported. Courthouses across the state held large bound ledgers, each page filled with careful script. Clerks were required to document marriages with the names of bride, groom, officiant, and witnesses. These entries were intended to endure, to stand as proof generations later when questions of inheritance or legitimacy arose. If a union was later challenged, lawyers would point to the register first. In the case of a preacher accused of marrying his own daughter, the clerk's pen would either confirm or contradict the rumor. The absence of such a record might prove the union had never been recognized, while the presence of an entry would open the door to charges of fraud and criminal conduct. The newspapers of Kansas in 1899 were small in circulation but wide in influence. Editors often worked with limited staff, setting type by hand and drawing content from local gossip, county court proceedings, and wire service reports. When word reached a newsroom that a preacher had performed or participated in a forbidden marriage, it would have been impossible to ignore. Headlines spoke in strong language: disgrace, shocking crime, scandal in the pulpit. Readers across counties would repeat the stories at kitchen tables, in fields, and in the pews on Sunday morning. Whether every detail was accurate mattered less in the immediate moment than the impact of the accusation itself. Churches operated as both spiritual havens and centers of social order. A congregation facing the charge that its preacher had crossed the most forbidden line would be forced into painful deliberation. Some members would cling to loyalty, insisting the man was misunderstood or maligned by enemies. Others would recoil, fearing divine judgment upon a community that allowed such sin to stand unpunished. Elders might convene meetings in the sanctuary. Prayers would be spoken with trembling voices, and letters of dismissal or suspension could be drafted against the preacher. These were not merely internal church matters. In rural Kansas, the standing of a congregation influenced the respectability of an entire town. Beyond the local scene, the broader cultural atmosphere of the late 19th century shaped how such cases were perceived. The closing years of the century were filled with public debates about morality, reform, and the role of law in defending the family. The temperance movement was growing strong, pressing against alcohol as the destroyer of homes. Women's groups called for higher standards of purity and protection of children. Against this backdrop, the idea of a preacher violating the sanctity of both law and family was doubly potent. It was not simply a private crime. It was a symbol of corruption that threatened the moral order reformers sought to build. Scholarly examinations of the period show how newspapers often exaggerated or simplified such events, yet they also reveal how frequently incest cases did surface in courts and in public discourse. Reports from Kansas and neighboring states show that prosecutions were not rare, though the details were sometimes concealed by vague language. Instead of printing names, a paper might speak of a well-known minister or a respected citizen, leaving readers to fill in the gaps. This practice both shielded identities and stoked rumor, ensuring that the story traveled further than a simple court docket entry ever could. The material traces of these episodes remain in archives: brittle newspaper pages, fading ink in county ledgers, and court files with handwritten judgments. Together they testify that allegations of incest, even when cloaked in secrecy, were met with swift reaction from law, press, and community. For a preacher in Kansas in 1899, to be accused of marrying his daughter in a midnight ceremony was to stand at the collision point of all these forces. The law branded the union void, The court could prosecute, the newspaper could condemn, and the church could expel. The weight of each institution pressed heavily upon the accused, ensuring that such a story, once spoken, could never simply fade back into silence. The unfolding of events in a Kansas town during 1899, when a preacher faced accusations of marrying his daughter, must be traced through the paper trail and the voices of the time. The courthouse, the newspaper office, and the church each contributed fragments that, when pieced together, show how the story spread, how it was interpreted, and how it was judged. The courthouse was often the first stop for any official notice. If a warrant was issued, it would have been written out in ink and signed by a county judge. Deputies or the sheriff would execute it, bringing the accused into custody. The docket book would record the charge, usually in terse language, incest or unlawful marriage. These dockets, lined in neat columns, provided the backbone of the criminal process. They did not capture the emotions or the whispers, but preserved the undeniable fact that the state had taken notice and acted. If a marriage register carried the preacher's name alongside that of his daughter, the contradiction between the solemn record and the void nature of such a union would have provided the first legal proof of wrongdoing. If the entry did not exist, then rumor and testimony would have to supply the case. While the law spoke in sparse language, the newspaper was more expansive. Reporters in small Kansas towns filled their columns with every variety of local detail: farm auctions, school contests, accidents, and sermons delivered on Sunday. When a scandal reached their ears, it gave them a chance to print stories that traveled far beyond their county. A midnight ceremony involving a preacher and his daughter would not remain confined to the shadows. Even if names were withheld, the identity of the figures involved often became clear to local readers. The paper might describe the man as a minister of long standing, or note that the ceremony occurred in secrecy within the county. Neighbors would piece together the rest, and before long the whispers became louder than the printed words. Regional papers, and sometimes even national weeklies, seized upon such stories. In a time when communication traveled by telegraph and train, sensational reports crossed state lines quickly. A scandal in Kansas could appear in Missouri papers within days, and in Chicago papers within a week. This amplification transformed a local crisis into a broader tale of moral failure in the clergy, feeding ongoing debates about corruption, sin, and the need for stricter moral oversight in society. The preacher who might have hoped his actions could remain hidden within a midnight gathering found his reputation echoed in distant cities, carried by print and rumor alike. The church community became both witness and tribunal. In rural Kansas, congregations were small but tightly knit. The preacher often baptized the children of his parishioners, officiated at their weddings, and comforted them at funerals. The accusation that he had married his own daughter would not only stain his role, but also ripple through every family in the pews. Elders likely convened special meetings, drawing together men and women who had known the preacher for years. Some may have insisted upon his innocence, claiming the rumor was exaggerated or invented by rivals. Others may have demanded immediate expulsion, fearing the wrath of God upon a congregation that harbored such sin. In those meetings, the air would have been thick with prayer, debate, and grief. Beyond the immediate congregation, neighboring churches also paid attention. Ministers in nearby towns might address the matter from their pulpits, warning their congregations of the dangers of moral laxity. Reports of such sermons sometimes found their way into the local press, adding another layer of public discourse. The scandal of one preacher became the lesson for many, a cautionary tale of how even those entrusted with sacred duties could fall into corruption. The broader social climate added still more pressure. The 1890s were years of reform and vigilance. The temperance movement, led in part by strong women's organizations, demanded purity in the home and community. Campaigns against vice, gambling, and sexual immorality filled speeches and pamphlets. A preacher accused of incest in 1899 was not just a man under suspicion. He became, willingly or unwillingly, a symbol in a larger battle over the nation's morals. Reformers seized upon such cases to argue that stronger laws were needed, that vigilance must be constant, and that no man, however cloaked in authority, should be exempt from scrutiny. The layers of record, legal dockets, newspaper columns, church minutes, and reform pamphlets, together created a storm that few individuals could withstand. For the preacher at the center of the 1899 case, each layer pressed against him. The law sought conviction, the press sought a story, the congregation sought purification, and the reformers sought a cause. The daughter's name, whether printed openly or shrouded in anonymity, was carried through this storm as well, her identity both shielded and exposed in the fragmented way newspapers of the time reported on victims. In archives today, fragments of this history can still be traced. Old newspapers preserved on brittle paper or microfilm record the scandal in bold headlines. County court files, if not lost to fire or neglect, carry the simple but decisive language of charges filed. Church records, where they survive, sometimes carry cryptic notes about expulsions or suspensions. Each piece confirms that in Kansas in 1899 the collision of law, church, and press could turn an act carried out in midnight secrecy into a story broadcast across the Midwest, remembered long after the individuals themselves had passed away. The machinery of justice in Kansas at the close of the 19th century was at once methodical and imperfect. When a preacher stood accused of violating both law and custom, the process that unfolded drew upon traditions that stretched back to territorial days and statutes shaped by decades of legislative reform. The courthouse became the stage where rumor gave way to testimony, where the whispers of neighbors were transformed into sworn statements, and where the fate of the accused was placed into the hands of judge and jury. The first step in any such case was the arrest. Sheriffs, often elected men who knew every family in their county, bore the heavy duty of executing warrants even when the accused was a neighbor or a respected minister. They carried writs signed by magistrates, rode out to farms or parsonages, and returned with the accused under guard. The act itself often drew a crowd, townspeople gathering at the depot or courthouse steps to watch the preacher led in, shackled or unshackled, depending on the sheriff's judgment. The arrest was not simply a legal measure. It was a public declaration that suspicion had hardened into formal accusation. Once within the courthouse, the ritual of arraignment followed. The clerk entered the charge into the docket book, the language often stark and unadorned: incest, unlawful marriage, statutory violation. The accused stood before the bench and entered a plea. Observers, if permitted in the gallery, strained to hear the words. A plea of not guilty meant that the case would proceed to trial. A guilty plea was rare in such matters, especially when reputation and livelihood were on the line. For a preacher, the very role he held pressed him toward denial, for confession in open court would have meant not only imprisonment but eternal shame in the eyes of his flock. The process of gathering testimony revealed the tensions of small-town life. Witnesses were often neighbors, relatives, or members of the same congregation. They were summoned by writs of subpoena, compelled to appear under penalty of law. In a case involving a midnight ceremony, Testimony might include the words of those who claimed to have seen figures gathering at unusual hours, or who heard whispers carried on the wind, or who spoke directly of vows exchanged. Each witness carried not only the facts they claimed to know, but also the weight of community judgment. To testify against a preacher was to risk division with those who still defended him. To remain silent was to risk suspicion of complicity. Newspapers took careful note of each development. Court sessions were fertile ground for reporters, who lingered near the benches, recorded the names of witnesses, and noted the reactions of the crowd. Columns describing such trials often blurred the line between fact and commentary. Reporters described the demeanor of the accused, whether he bowed his head in shame or stood defiantly. They described the atmosphere of the courtroom, the gas lamps flickering against high ceilings, the hush that fell when the prosecutor rose to speak, the murmurs that rippled through the audience when testimony touched on forbidden subjects. These written accounts were carried into homes, read aloud at supper tables, and passed among neighbors who could not attend in person. The prosecutor's role was shaped by the statutes themselves. Kansas law left no ambiguity about the void nature of incestuous unions, but securing a conviction required more than citing the code. It required evidence, proof that a ceremony occurred, proof of the relationship between the parties, proof of intent. In the absence of a signed marriage license, the prosecutor might rely on oral testimony, circumstantial evidence, or admissions made outside of court. The defense, in turn, would seek to undermine witnesses, casting doubt on their reliability or motives. In a small community, accusations of personal feuds or grudges were common, and defense attorneys often argued that scandal arose not from fact but from malice. Behind the formal proceedings lay the unspoken struggles of those most directly affected. The daughter at the center of the case was not simply a name in the docket, but a person whose life would be scrutinized by the town and beyond. Newspapers of the time often withheld the names of women in such circumstances, referring only to the daughter or the young woman. Yet within the community, anonymity was thin protection. Neighbors already knew who she was. The burden she carried was immense, not only in the courtroom but in the church pew, the market, and every public place. Church authorities often watched the trial closely. Some congregations suspended their preacher immediately upon arrest, while others waited for the verdict of the court. In either case, the authority of the pulpit was broken. Replacement ministers were called in to fill the gap, preaching sermons on purity, obedience, and the dangers of sin even while the trial was underway. For parishioners, attending service during such a season was an act of endurance. Every hymn carried an undertone of sorrow, every prayer a plea for cleansing. The sanctuary itself, once a place of unity, became a site of division. Beyond the courthouse and the sanctuary, the broader public consumed the story as a lesson in morality. Reform movements seized upon such cases to illustrate their arguments. Women's groups circulated pamphlets decrying the dangers of unchecked male authority. Advocates of stricter marriage regulations pointed to Kansas statutes as a model, but demanded more rigorous enforcement. For them, the preacher's alleged crime was not an isolated failure, but part of a larger struggle to safeguard homes and children from corruption. When the trial reached its climax, the atmosphere was heavy with expectation. Jurors, farmers, merchants, and laborers drawn from the same county, listened to closing arguments that framed the case as either a monstrous betrayal or a malicious slander. The judge instructed them according to the statutes, emphasizing the void nature of incestuous unions and the duty of the law to uphold morality. Their deliberation took place behind closed doors, but the crowd outside waited in restless silence, knowing that the verdict would echo far beyond the courthouse walls. The outcome, whether conviction or acquittal, carried consequences that could not be erased. A conviction meant imprisonment and permanent disgrace, his name etched into the record of Kansas crime. An acquittal, though sparing him prison, did little to restore his standing. The accusation alone had already destroyed his reputation, fractured his congregation, and marked his family with shame. In either case, the preacher's place in the community was lost, and the story entered the larger current of public memory, preserved in ink and in recollection long after the individuals themselves faded from life. In the aftermath of a trial, whether the verdict declared guilt or acquittal, the reverberations across a Kansas community in 1899 were profound. The courthouse may have closed its doors after judgment was read, but the people did not leave the matter behind. They carried it into their conversations, their pulpits, their homes, and even their politics. A preacher accused of marrying his own daughter left behind more than a personal scandal. He left behind a rift that ran through every institution surrounding him. For those who sat in the pews of his congregation, the rupture was immediate. The pulpit, once the highest place of authority in their weekly lives, now stood vacant or occupied by a substitute sent from another town. The songs of Sunday mornings sounded different in that absence. Congregants found themselves looking not at their hymnals but at one another, weighing whether their neighbor had testified, or whether the family across the aisle whispered in defense or in condemnation. Some families chose to leave the church altogether, seeking a fresh start in a different parish or even in another town. Others clung stubbornly to their pews, refusing to abandon the sanctuary they had helped to build. In both cases, unity had been fractured, and the wound would not easily heal. The preacher himself, stripped of his authority, faced a future that was equally uncertain. A conviction might carry him into the penitentiary, where his life would shift from pulpit to prison cell. His name entered into the rolls of the state's inmates. If acquitted, he might avoid the cell but not the stain. Employment for a disgraced minister was scarce. Few congregations would risk hiring a man whose name had been linked to such charges. The itinerant ministry, already difficult in a state where towns were scattered by miles of prairie, became nearly impossible for a man burdened with infamy. The daughter's life was marked even more heavily. In a culture that prized purity and reputation, her name, whether printed in papers or merely spoken in whispers, would be carried with her everywhere. In rural Kansas at the end of the century, marriage was not merely a personal choice but a social contract, binding families together and ensuring economic stability. For a young woman named in such a scandal, prospects of marriage diminished sharply. Neighbors might turn away, suitors might withdraw, and the very idea of starting a family could be clouded by the lingering shadow of her father's actions. Even if she attempted to move to another county, rumors had a way of following, especially when newspapers carried the story far beyond her hometown. The wider community found itself debating not only the facts of the case, but also its meaning. Farmers at grain elevators, merchants in general stores, and mothers in quilting circles all gave voice to their views. Some spoke of the event as a sign of moral decay, warning that if even a preacher could fall into such corruption, then no institution was safe. Others cast suspicion on the veracity of the charges, pointing to rivalries within congregations or jealousies among townspeople. The town itself became divided between those who believed the worst and those who refused to accept it, with friendships broken and alliances reshaped along these lines. Newspapers, having fueled the scandal in its rise, continued to shape its aftermath. Editorials drew lessons from the case, calling for vigilance in choosing ministers, for stricter oversight of marriages, and for a deeper reliance on law to guard the sanctity of the family. Out-of-state papers that picked up the story often stripped it of nuance, presenting Kansas as a place of frontier lawlessness where even ministers defied basic moral codes. These external portrayals weighed heavily on towns that prided themselves on order and respectability. Residents resented being defined by a scandal, yet they could not deny that the headlines had fixed their town's name in the public mind. The reform movements of the era seized upon the preacher's disgrace as further evidence in their campaigns. Women's Christian Temperance Union chapters, already active in Kansas, used such stories to emphasize their warnings about unchecked male authority and the vulnerability of women within patriarchal structures. Lectures and pamphlets spoke of the need to strengthen laws protecting women and children, not only against alcohol and vice, but against corruption within the family itself. Though the specific details of one case might fade with time, reformers wove it into a larger narrative of moral struggle, a reminder of what could happen if vigilance lapsed. Political leaders, too, could not ignore the scandal. County commissioners, legislators, and candidates for office sometimes referenced notorious cases in their speeches, promising to uphold morality and enforce the statutes without favoritism. For them, aligning with the public's outrage offered both moral credibility and political capital. Even when no new laws were passed immediately, the atmosphere of suspicion and concern influenced how existing laws were interpreted and enforced. Prosecutors grew bolder in bringing charges, and juries became more willing to convict. The personal cost, however, remained deepest for the family at the center. A preacher cast out of his pulpit, a daughter marked by whispers, a household fractured beyond repair. These were the enduring scars. Neighbors might one day forget the exact wording of the statute or the length of the sentence, but they remembered the faces of those who had lived under their gaze. Children in schoolyards might repeat the story for years, attaching it to surnames that bore the brunt of shame. Time eventually blurred the details, but the impression remained. Years later, when new scandals arose, older residents would recall 1899 as the year the preacher was accused of marrying his daughter under cover of night. They would tell the story not as lawyers or journalists, but as witnesses to the rupture of their community's order. Each retelling added another layer, until the event lived not only in records but in memory, a cautionary tale passed from one generation to the next. By the first years of the new century, the scandal of 1899 had already begun to harden into memory, yet its echoes lingered in ways both subtle and overt. Kansas, a state forged in the crucible of territorial conflict and shaped by a fervent sense of civic morality, did not easily forget the stain left by a preacher accused of crossing the most forbidden boundary. The reverberations of that case were not confined to the immediate family or congregation, but spread outward into law, culture, and collective identity. In the courts, the case served as a precedent in the minds of prosecutors and judges, even if no formal citation appeared in the law books. Legal officials remembered it when weighing how to handle subsequent accusations of incest or unlawful marriage. Where once hesitation might have slowed proceedings, the memory of a preacher's midnight ceremony provided motivation for swift action. District attorneys grew less reluctant to bring charges, and judges, conscious of community outrage, often spoke from the bench in tones that underscored the seriousness of such crimes. In this way, one scandal shaped the tone of justice for years afterward, not through new legislation, but through practice and interpretation of the statutes already in place. For the newspapers, the preacher's downfall became a touchstone, invoked whenever new moral controversies arose. Editors, keen to remind readers of the dangers of unchecked authority, alluded to the case in oblique references, a scandal not unlike the infamous affair of '99. Such phrasing kept the memory alive without reprinting every detail. In rural journalism, where memory was long and circulation was tight, these reminders reinforced a shared understanding. Kansas communities would not tolerate violations of sacred trust, especially by men who claimed the mantle of spiritual leadership. The church, too, carried the legacy of the scandal. Within congregations across the state, elders tightened their oversight of ministers, insisting upon clearer lines of accountability. In some denominations, conferences adopted stricter rules regarding the conduct of clergy, aiming to prevent both the reality and the rumor of impropriety. Preachers themselves, aware of the shadow cast by the 1899 case, often addressed the subject directly in sermons, warning their flocks of the wages of sin and reassuring them of their own integrity. In this way, the scandal shaped the very discourse of the pulpit, reminding ministers that their personal lives were inseparable from their sacred office. The broader reform movements of the era found renewed strength in stories like this one. Women's groups, already active in campaigns for suffrage and temperance, pointed to the scandal as evidence that society's guardians could not always be trusted to guard themselves. They argued for more robust protections for women and children, advocating for laws that expanded the definition of incest, increased penalties, and offered clearer avenues for victims to seek justice. Pamphlets and speeches often carried the general lesson rather than the specific case, but the timing was no coincidence. In the collective narrative of reform, the preacher's transgression served as both warning and rallying cry. For the townspeople who had lived through the trial, the years brought both healing and lingering discomfort. Some families moved away, seeking distance from a name that had become too heavy to bear. Others stayed, determined to reclaim their place in the community, though they walked under the shadow of whispered recollections. Children who had sat in the courtroom gallery grew into adults who repeated the story to their own offspring, ensuring that the memory of the preacher's fall endured not just in documents, but in oral tradition. It became part of the lore of Kansas small-town life, one of those tales recalled whenever neighbors gathered to speak of the past. The daughter's path through these years was likely the hardest. In a culture that measured women's worth so heavily by reputation, the association with scandal was a burden not easily shed. Even if she relocated, her past could resurface through newspaper clippings or the recollections of those who traveled between towns. Marriage prospects may have narrowed, and opportunities diminished, not because of anything she chose, but because of the choices made by her father. Her life story, written in silence and resilience, illustrates the quiet cost of public scandal in an age when women bore disproportionate blame for the sins of men. At the state level, the scandal contributed to an atmosphere of vigilance. Kansas legislators revisited the statutes periodically, reaffirming the language that declared incestuous marriages void and refining the criminal codes that punished such acts. Though they did not always mention the preacher of 1899 by name, the memory of that case and others like it shaped their sense of urgency. The law was more than ink on paper. It was a reflection of the community's demand for order and purity. Even decades later, when the details grew faint, the story of the preacher who married his daughter in a midnight ceremony retained symbolic power. For some, it was a tale of hypocrisy in the pulpit, a warning that even men of faith could fall. For others, it was a tragedy of community, where an entire town was drawn into the consequences of one man's choices. In both versions, the story endured as part of Kansas's moral landscape, woven into the fabric of how communities remembered their struggles with sin, scandal, and the fragile boundaries of trust. The scandal of 1899 thus lived on not only in the courthouse records and yellowed newspapers, but also in the way Kansans told stories about themselves. It became one of those reference points that shaped local identity, reminding each generation that the preservation of moral order was not automatic, but demanded vigilance, judgment, and, when necessary, the painful work of public reckoning. When the calendar moved into the second decade of the 20th century, the preacher's scandal of 1899 no longer stood as a raw wound, but as a remembered marker of what a community could endure and what it could not forgive. By then, Kansas had already passed through the fires of prohibition battles, suffrage debates, and the steady march of reform movements that sought to strengthen the moral foundations of family and church. Yet, the memory of a preacher who had defied both law and scripture by marrying his own daughter under the cover of midnight did not simply dissolve into the flow of years. It became a narrative thread, pulled forward by retelling, reshaped by commentary, and preserved in the twin archives of paper and memory. In the courthouse files, the case remained frozen in ink. Ledgers recorded the charge, the plea, and the outcome in the same measured script used for property disputes and cattle thefts. Clerks of later decades, flipping through those pages, could not help but notice the stark words of accusation that stood out among the mundane. The act of recording, neutral and bureaucratic though it seemed, carried forward the weight of judgment. Every time the book was opened, the scandal was recalled anew. 4 county officials charged with preserving order, it remained an emblem of the dangers of secrecy and the necessity of vigilance. Newspapers, too, carried the story forward, though now it appeared not as headline news but as a touchstone in commentary. When later scandals arose, be they moral failings of public figures, financial frauds, or breaches of trust, editors occasionally invoked the memory of the infamous affair at the close of the century. They seldom printed names by then, but the allusion was enough. Readers knew the reference. They remembered the preacher, the midnight vows, the shattered congregation. The story had become shorthand for betrayal of trust, a way of reminding the public that no man, however esteemed, was immune to corruption. Within the church world, the legacy was even more deeply felt. The Kansas congregations that had weathered the storm of 1899 did not forget how swiftly their unity had been broken. Subsequent ministers preached under the shadow of that memory. They were scrutinized more carefully, held to stricter standards, and sometimes reminded, quietly in private meetings with elders, of the scandal that once nearly destroyed the witness of the pulpit. This caution extended into denominational policy. Conferences and synods began to insist upon closer oversight of clergy, requiring clearer accountability structures and swifter mechanisms for discipline. The preacher of 1899, though disgraced, thus shaped the ministry long after his voice was silenced. The broader cultural reform movements, which by the 1910s were reaching new heights with campaigns for national prohibition and women's suffrage, continued to draw upon cases like this one as evidence of society's need for protection. Leaders of women's organizations cited the scandal in speeches and tracts, not always by name but by type. A minister abusing his authority, a daughter betrayed by the very figure meant to guard her, a community wounded by secrecy. For reformers, the lesson was clear. Laws must be strong, oversight must be constant, and women must be granted a greater voice in shaping the institutions that govern their lives. The preacher's sin, therefore, was not only his own. It was cast as emblematic of a larger imbalance in power and morality. For the families directly touched by the scandal, the years brought both distance and enduring weight. The preacher himself, if still alive, lived in obscurity. His name, once spoken from pulpits and printed in bulletins, had become a whisper, sometimes spat in derision, sometimes spoken in pity. His daughter bore the heavier burden. In a culture that remembered women chiefly through the lens of purity and family, she was marked by association, her story entangled with his in ways that she had never chosen. Even as time passed, her life could not escape the shadow of those vows spoken in secrecy. Communities have a way of weaving scandal into folklore, and so it was here. By the time 2 decades had passed, the younger generation spoke of the case not as courtroom fact, but as a cautionary tale. Around stoves in winter, on porches in summer, old men and women recounted the year when a preacher had fallen so far. The story shifted with the telling. Some emphasized the midnight ceremony, others the courtroom drama, others the collapse of the church. What remained constant was the moral. Betrayal of sacred trust leads to ruin, and no secrecy can shield such acts from eventual exposure. In this way, the scandal became part of Kansas's oral tradition, a piece of local identity as enduring as tales of droughts, floods, and prairie fires. The symbolic power of the story extended even beyond Kansas. As newspapers from other states had reprinted the account in 1899, the memory lived on in wider circles. For readers in Missouri, Nebraska, or Illinois, the Kansas preacher who married his daughter became a stock example in sermons, lectures, and editorials. In this way, one community's anguish fed into a larger national narrative about morality on the American frontier and the need for vigilance in upholding family order. Historians who later examined the records of such cases noted how they reflected both the fragility and resilience of small communities. Fragility, because a single scandal could fracture trust and unsettle the bonds that held a town together. Resilience, because communities, after enduring shock, did not collapse but adapted, setting stricter standards and rebuilding their institutions. The scandal of 1899 demonstrated both truths. It revealed how deeply one man's sin could wound a community, and it showed how, in time, that community found ways to live with the memory, to incorporate it into its identity, and to continue forward. Thus, by the time the scandal of 1899 was 2 decades in the past, it had ceased to be merely the story of one preacher and his daughter. It had become a lesson, a parable of sorts, used to warn, to instruct, and to remind. The midnight vows were long undone, the trial long over, the congregation dispersed or healed, but the memory remained fixed in Kansas life, etched in law, carried in print, whispered in sermons, and retold around kitchen tables. The scandal had outlived the man, the trial, and perhaps even the witnesses, becoming part of the enduring moral landscape of the state. By the 1920s, Kansas had become a state defined by reformist zeal. It was a land of prohibition long before the rest of the nation followed suit, a place where church and law often walked hand in hand in shaping the boundaries of public life. Yet even amid the drive toward order and morality, the scandal of 1899 remained an uneasy reminder that darkness could emerge from within the very institutions meant to guard against it. The preacher's case did not vanish. It shifted into the background of cultural memory, where it surfaced whenever new controversies tested community trust. Town elders, when gathered at civic meetings, occasionally recalled the disgrace as a warning against placing blind faith in men who claimed moral authority. Preachers themselves, when admonishing congregations about purity and vigilance, sometimes alluded to a minister of shame from a generation past, drawing upon the familiar story without speaking his name. In this way, the incident lived on as a silent regulator of conduct, shaping behavior not by law alone but by memory. The press of the 1920s, busy chronicling prohibition battles, political contests, and the rhythms of rural life, nonetheless preserved the scandal in oblique references. Anniversary pieces that looked back at the most sensational trials in county history listed the preacher's midnight vows among them. Readers nodded with recognition, for the case had passed into the category of legend, not a story that required retelling in full, but one whose mere mention evoked the whole. For older readers, it stirred recollections of whispers in 1899. For younger ones, it was confirmation of a tale they had grown up hearing in fragments. In the realm of law, the case's shadow was more subtle but no less real. Kansas legislators and judges of the 1920s operated within a framework that had been shaped, in part, by earlier scandals. The language of statutes on incest and unlawful marriage had been clarified, reinforced, and defended against challenge. Prosecutors pointed to the moral consensus forged in earlier decades, where outrage over a preacher's defiance had underscored the state's duty to enforce its laws without hesitation. The memory of 1899 thus lived in the confidence with which cases were pursued, the swiftness with which juries reached their verdicts, and the severity with which sentences were pronounced. For the congregation once fractured by the scandal, the years had brought both healing and permanent change. New ministers came and went, none holding the same central authority as the disgraced preacher. Lay leaders took on greater roles, perhaps unconsciously determined never again to allow one man unchecked power. The church that had nearly collapsed survived by dispersing authority, a structural lesson drawn from bitter experience. Even those who had not been alive in 1899 could feel the weight of that history in the way their congregation was governed. The preacher himself, if he lived into these years, did so outside the reach of pulpit and congregation. His name was not called in church rolls, nor printed in bulletins, nor invoked in public prayer. He became an exile, even if he resided in the same state. The silence surrounding him was its own form of punishment, a social banishment as enduring as any prison term. The daughter, by then older herself, bore a story that could not easily be told. In a culture that gave little voice to women wronged by circumstance, her life was lived under the unspoken weight of what had once been printed in bold letters. At the community level, the scandal remained part of folklore. Farmers at harvest suppers, townsfolk at county fairs, and families gathered around stoves in winter all had their way of telling it. Some versions cast the preacher as a deceiver who cloaked his desires in Scripture. Others painted him as a man consumed by madness. Still others softened the tale, portraying the daughter as victim of her father's delusion and the community as victim of betrayal. The details varied, but the moral remained. Sin could wear the mask of piety, and communities must guard against misplaced trust. Beyond Kansas, the story was absorbed into the broader national image of the Midwest. Writers and commentators sometimes portrayed the region as a paradox, a place of stern morality where, nonetheless, shocking scandals erupted. The preacher's midnight ceremony was cited in articles about frontier justice, rural hypocrisy, and the complexities of small-town life. In these depictions, Kansas became a mirror of America's own struggle between its ideals and its failings. Thus, by the 1920s, the scandal of 1899 had become something larger than itself. It was no longer merely the tale of one preacher's fall. It was a cultural marker, a symbol invoked whenever Kansans sought to explain why vigilance mattered, why reform was necessary, and why even the most trusted figures must be held accountable. It lingered in law, in sermons, and in silence. Its details faded with time, but its meaning grew, until it stood less as a story about individuals and more as a parable about community, morality, and the thin line between trust and betrayal. By the 1930s, The United States was in the grip of the Great Depression. Kansas, like much of the Midwest, endured drought, dust storms, and economic hardship that tested the endurance of entire communities. In such a climate, survival often took precedence over memory. Yet even amid hardship, the scandal of 1899 retained its place in the cultural consciousness. Stories of past moral failings were not erased by new struggles. Instead, they were recalled as reminders of the frailty of human institutions, lessons that seemed all the more relevant in a time when faith and resilience were daily necessities. In county archives, the preacher's case remained preserved in the same ledgers that now recorded foreclosures and relief petitions. Clerks who tended those records sometimes remarked on the stark contrast. Pages filled with the routine transactions of land and livestock, then suddenly interrupted by the shocking record of incestuous marriage. The ink on those lines did not fade with time. As officials in the 1930s leafed through the books, searching for precedents or verifying property claims, the scandal of decades past reappeared with renewed sharpness. The newspapers of this era, though preoccupied with economic collapse and the spread of the Dust Bowl, occasionally revived older scandals in retrospective pieces. Kansas editors, eager to remind readers that their communities had endured crisis before, compiled lists of sensational trials that shocked the county. In those columns, the preacher's midnight vows of 1899 were recalled as among the darkest stains on local history. For younger readers who had not lived through it, the printed account confirmed what they had heard whispered in their households. For older ones, it reopened memories of courtroom testimony, fractured congregations, and community outrage. The church, too, carried the memory forward, though often in silence. Ministers in the 1930s, struggling to hold congregations together in the face of poverty and dislocation, nonetheless understood that their authority could never again rest solely on personal trust. The lesson of 1899 had taught communities that spiritual leaders must be watched as carefully as politicians or businessmen. As a result, lay leaders exercised a stronger hand in governance, and congregants expected higher transparency in clerical life. Even if the preacher's name was never spoken, the caution shaped the everyday practice of faith. For the family at the center of the scandal, if any members survived into these years, the burden remained. The daughter, now decades older, may have lived quietly, her story submerged beneath the pressing concerns of economic survival. Yet her name, once printed in newspapers and entered into courthouse files, carried a weight that no drought or depression could erase. Neighbors remembered, even if they did not speak of it openly. In small towns, reputations were not forgotten. They were stored in memory, ready to be recalled when least desired. Communities, facing the struggles of the Depression, used stories like the preacher's fall as moral instruction. Around kitchen tables and in community halls, elders reminded the younger generation that moral collapse could wound a town as deeply as economic hardship. The scandal of 1899 became part of the moral heritage passed on to children who had never seen the preacher, never walked into the courthouse during his trial, yet knew the outlines of the story as if it were their own. Such stories served not only as warnings but as bonds, linking one generation's trials to the next. At the state level, legal memory endured as well. Prosecutors and judges of the 1930s, facing cases of abuse and unlawful marriage, cited the need for strict enforcement by pointing to earlier scandals. Though they did not always name the preacher of 1899, the principle was clear. Kansas would not be lenient in matters of incest and betrayal of familial duty. The legacy of outrage from decades before still shaped the severity of sentences handed down in courtrooms. Nationally, Journalists who chronicled rural America during the Depression sometimes invoked Kansas's past scandals as symbols of deeper truths. They wrote of small towns where the veneer of morality could be cracked by desperation or corruption, recalling the preacher's midnight ceremony as one of many examples of hidden darkness on the prairie. These accounts were less about the individual preacher and more about the struggle of communities to reconcile their ideals with human weakness. In this way, the scandal of 1899 transcended its local origins and entered the larger cultural narrative of American resilience and hypocrisy. Thus, by the 1930s, the Preacher's Act had become less a fresh wound than a moral landmark. It was recalled in newspapers, whispered in congregations, passed down in families, and embedded in the way Kansas understood its own history. Even as the Dust Bowl scoured the land and the Depression hollowed out livelihoods, the memory of 1899 endured. It stood as a reminder that hardship could take many forms, sometimes delivered by nature, sometimes by economics, and sometimes by the betrayal of those most trusted. In that sense, the scandal remained alive, not merely as a tale of sin, but as a symbol of the fragility and endurance of community life on the plains. By the middle of the 20th century, Kansas had entered a new era. The Dust Bowl storms of the 1930s had given way to slow recovery, and the turbulence of 2 world wars reshaped the lives of every family in the state. Yet even as the landscape and the society changed, the scandal of 1899 lingered. No longer a subject of front-page headlines, it survived in memory, in courthouse ledgers, in yellowed newspapers folded away in attics, and in the whispered tales of elders. It had become part of the folklore of Kansas, a story retold less for its details than for the lesson it carried. In small towns, where continuity stretched across generations, the story was sustained through oral tradition. Grandparents, sitting on porches in the fading light, spoke to grandchildren about the preacher who lost his way. They seldom recounted every legal proceeding or every newspaper line, but they conveyed the essence, that a man of God had broken the most sacred boundary, that a daughter had borne the cost, and that a community had been shaken to its core. For the young, the tale sounded almost like a parable, something distant and cautionary, yet tied directly to the soil under their feet. Courthouse clerks of the 1940s and 1950s, still tending the same ledgers that had been opened in 1899, encountered the case as they moved through the volumes. The handwriting from that year stood out as a relic of a different age, ink-faded but legible, the words void marriage and incest stark against the surrounding lists of property disputes and livestock claims. Each encounter reminded officials that the law was not abstract, but had been applied in moments that seared themselves into the life of the county. Even as modern filing systems and typewriters began to replace handwritten registers, the old books were preserved, ensuring that the Preacher's Act would never fully disappear. The press, by mid-century, referenced the scandal primarily in retrospective pieces. When local papers ran features on the trials that shaped our county, the 1899 preacher often appeared alongside notorious murderers, bank robbers, and swindlers. His inclusion signaled that, though no blood had been spilled, his act ranked among the gravest betrayals of public trust. For readers who had lived through the original event, such articles stirred old emotions. For those who had not, they served as an education in the darker corners of their community's past. Within the church, the legacy endured in structures and attitudes more than in words. Ministers of the 1950s, leading congregations in a post-war world of growth and optimism, were nonetheless subject to oversight shaped by the scandal of half a century before. Lay committees, boards of elders, and denominational supervisors held their clergy accountable with vigilance, a direct inheritance of the distrust born in 1899. Even if the preacher's name was never spoken, the caution his actions had instilled guided church governance, reminding leaders that the pulpit must never again be placed beyond scrutiny. The daughter, if she lived into these decades, would have carried the burden of association for a lifetime. In a culture where reputations lasted longer than the individuals themselves, her name remained tied to the scandal. Neighbors remembered. Even if silence fell over conversations in her presence, the silence itself testified to the weight of her past. Her story, preserved in records and whispered in memory, stood as a testament to the personal cost of a father's transgression. By the 1960s and 1970s, historians and journalists began to take greater interest in compiling the hidden histories of local communities. In county histories and anniversary booklets, the scandal of 1899 appeared as one of the defining episodes of the turn of the century. Some writers emphasized its shock value, others treated it as a symbol of the dangers of unaccountable authority. Either way, it entered the historical narrative, no longer confined to whispers, but set down as part of the record of Kansas life. Nationally, as America passed through the upheavals of the mid-20th century, the civil rights movement, the questioning of institutions, the challenges to authority, the scandal of 1899 gained new resonance. It became an example cited in discussions of power, corruption, and the vulnerability of those under authority. Scholars and journalists looking for historical parallels often reached back to such cases, pointing out that betrayal of trust by figures of influence was not a modern phenomenon, but a recurring danger in every era. For the communities that had lived through it, the scandal became part of their collective identity. It was remembered not only for its shocking details, but for what it revealed about resilience. They had endured public shame, division, and distrust, yet they had also rebuilt their churches, upheld their laws, and passed forward a stronger caution to future generations. The story, though born in secrecy under a midnight sky, had grown into a permanent lesson about vigilance, accountability, and the frailty of human virtue. Thus, by the close of the 20th century, the preacher's secret marriage of 1899 was no longer just a scandal. It was a parable woven into the fabric of Kansas history. It endured in records, in memory, in folklore, and in scholarship, serving as a reminder that communities are tested not only by storms of nature or struggles of economy, but by the betrayals that arise from within. And though the preacher, his daughter, and their immediate community had long since passed away, the weight of what had happened remained, etched into the collective conscience of a state that had never forgotten. And so, the shadows of 1899 remind us that even the most trusted figures can carry the darkest secrets, and that memory itself can be both a wound and a warning. If you've walked with me through this journey, make sure to leave your thoughts below. I read every single one. And if you want more stories carved from the hidden stone of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with me here at Eternal Obsidian, where the past is never forgotten.